Good morning from Las Vegas. My name is Frank Gaffney. I am the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. I'm very pleased to be here with the Chairman of the committee, Brian Kennedy, about whom you'll hear more in a moment, and Dr. Sean Lin, about whom you may already have heard something, but we'll introduce him properly as well. We believe that Jim Marchant will be joining us as well in due course. We apologize for the late start. It turns out that when the President of the United States is in town, Vegas comes to a screeching halt. I was at the airport, Brian was at the Trump Hotel, and neither of us were able to get here on time. So for those of you who were on time, thank you for bearing with us. For those of you who are just joining us now, welcome. We're very pleased to be here in Las Vegas on the eve of the caucus that will be taking place this weekend. We hope very much to have the information that we're going to be imparting today about the Chinese Communist Party, what it's doing, its purposes, and its implications will factor into some of the thinking and debate and decision-making involving the choice by Nevada voters of the next commander-in-chief of the United States, because we're certain that whoever that person is, whatever party they may be from, whatever political philosophy they may adhere to, they will find, and indeed our country will find, that job one, whether it's in the national security domain or whether it's in the economic portfolio, or more likely it seems, whether it's in the public health arena, job one for the next commander-in-chief is going to be Communist China. So we're here, as I say, to shed light on this. We are part of a team that has been pulled together under the banner of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. I'll just say a word about the genesis of this particular iteration of that committee's rather distinguished pedigree, we think, and then turn it over to Brian Kennedy, our chairman, to sort of provide the big picture on China and why we think it's so important that this topic be in the election process and dynamic for candidates, again, of all parties. This is not a partisan presentation. This is just the facts, ma'am. Back in the mid-1970s, another version or iteration of this committee came together. That particular Committee on the Present Danger, like ours, was made up of national security professionals, subject matter experts, business leaders, religious freedom activists, and human rights champions that came together to try to help craft an alternative strategy for dealing with that time's existential threat to freedom, as Ronald Reagan used to call it. Interestingly enough, he was a member of that Committee on the Present Danger, and it was in league with his own thinking on this subject that those experts and advocates and champions helped devise an alternative strategy to détente, as it was called, a kind of engagement, if you will, in that era that had as its general premise that if we simply helped bring the Soviet Union into the community of nations, if we enriched them, if we did arms control deals with them, if we disarmed, in fact, they would become more benign and the world would become a safer place. Ronald Reagan disagreed, the members of the Committee on the Present Danger disagreed, and they came up with a strategy that I think Reagan basically described as peace through strength. And ultimately, it had as its purpose rolling back the Soviet Union, the evil empire. The members of that committee were instrumental in helping to socialize this idea, to help advance it in the political milieu of the 1980 election, not again as partisans, but as champions of an alternative to détente. And once Ronald Reagan won election, in part with a mandate to take a different course with the Soviets, they became, in large numbers, some 31 of them, members of his administration and assisted him in implementing the strategy that they helped devise. The rest, as they say, is history. The Soviet Union is no more, of course. That existential threat dissipated. It's undergone some changes in the meantime, but the new and very much more serious danger, for reasons that Brian and Sean will be talking about, is China. And communist China, we believe, requires every bit as much some fresh thinking, because the policy of engagement, as it's been called, with China hasn't worked any better than détente did with the Soviet Union, and for many of the same reasons. We believe very strongly that for these sorts of priority considerations, as I said, America's next commander-in-chief, next president, must understand, must demonstrate an understanding of what China is up to, and must be able to articulate a plan as to what he or she intends to do about the present and growing danger from China. We have another reason for being in this state. This is the fourth of a series of such, we call them 2020 policy battle space threat briefings that we have conducted, the first in Iowa, the second in New Hampshire, the third just yesterday in South Carolina. And there will be a number more of them to come, where we're going to try to both address that main point, but also to acquaint people in these states about a very serious consideration with respect to the present and growing danger from China, namely that virtually any of the various, I call them threat vectors, that China is pursuing, that you wish to focus upon, whether it's economic warfare, whether it's the bid to dominate space, whether it is the buildup of immense numbers of various kinds of weapon systems, whether it is their determination to build out a colonial empire around the world under the rubric of something they call the Belt and Road Initiative. These and many others, influence operations, espionage, and so on, all of them are being made possible in substantial measure, if not virtually entirely, by us, by our underwriting of communist Chinese companies that are engaged in one or the other of these activities, and that are therefore being made more dangerous to us with our money. Money from individual investors, but most of it from institutional investors, including in most states, but I'm happy to say not here in Nevada, but in most states through the public pension funds that are investing in these companies, as is much of Wall Street at the moment. So we're here to raise awareness about that reality as well, to cite Nevada, in fact, as a model for how state public pension funds and others can make good money without enriching the very Chinese communist enterprises and the Chinese Communist Party for whom they work, to our profound detriment and perhaps deadly peril. So with that background as to why we're here, why we are hoping to both convey these messages to people in the presidential political environment, the voters most especially, and to state officials, whether they be in the executive branch or the legislative branch, at whatever level, particularly the state level, but for that matter, the federal level as well. This is vitally important information. We're so appreciative of you taking the time to take it aboard. And with that, let me introduce my friend and colleague, Brian Kennedy. Brian has been in the business of public policy for decades, notably for many years with the Claremont Institute, ultimately serving for, I believe, about a decade as its president. The Claremont Institute is an distinguished public policy research organization in California, of course. Brian has gone on to found and now directs the American Strategies Group, and he is, as I've said, the distinguished and very valued chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Brian Kennedy, over to you.
Well, thank you, Frank. I'm the chairman of the committee, but of course Frank is the great engine when it comes to American national security policy. And the country owes you a great debt of gratitude for all you do, Frank, and going around the country like this, trying to explain to the American people what really is going on in China is a very valuable thing. Well, let me say first, the committee is a wholly independent and nonpartisan effort to explain to the American people the threat from the Communist Chinese. The reason we're in Nevada, I can remember you and I were here probably almost 20 years ago talking about national missile defense and the need for a national missile defense, and we were doing it here in Las Vegas. And the reason, of course, was any enemy we would have, whether it was the Soviet Union or Communist China, would target the Hoover Dam. Because if you could destroy the Hoover Dam with a nuclear weapon, you would destroy not only Las Vegas, but you would have a huge impact on all of Southern California and the electrical infrastructure of the Southwest United States. And we understood back then it's important to talk to everyday Americans in places like this, because they're the ones who not only make the American economy work, they're the ones who go and fight our wars, and they deserve a better account from people and politicians, really, about what the threats are to this country. If we had a fully functioning, well-functioning national security apparatus in Washington, D.C., we wouldn't be having either the committee and we wouldn't be here today. We live in the most partisan times ever in our country's history. And so we thought with this effort it would be useful to go to explain to Americans on both sides of the political aisle just what was before them. And this whole effort is built on the idea that Americans, when armed with the facts, will do the right thing, that they'll understand what it is that needs to be done and then pursue that. Now, during the Cold War, as Frank was suggesting, with the Soviet Union, that was much easier to do. We had this Sputnik moment in the United States when the Soviet Union went to outer space. Americans thought that we were falling behind, and we woke up to the idea that the Soviet Union was a real threat. Well, today we have the People's Republic of China and their Communist Party. We've never had a Sputnik moment with them. We've never had the moment where we thought the Chinese Communist Party was a threat to the United States. Well, with President Trump, he's been highlighting for over 20 years the dangers of China, them stealing our intellectual property, them denying us access to their markets, and as of late, their military buildup. This is the kind of thing that Americans are concerned about. But unlike during the Cold War, we had no real serious economic relations with the Soviet Union. Today, we have very elaborate economic relations with the PRC. And American industry and businesses and American business people and economic elites do an awful lot of business with China, giving China a built-in lobby for any change in our public policy, so that when President Trump talks about the need to rebalance our trade relationship or the need to stop the theft of intellectual property, there are a whole lot of people on Wall Street who raise all sorts of alarms that cracking down on the Chinese will ultimately lead to harmful effects on our economy. And President Trump for 20 years has been saying, we may have to go through that, but it's simply unacceptable for the United States to have its intellectual property stolen the way it has been. And part of our efforts in this committee has been to try to penetrate that very one-sided Chinese Communist propaganda that you see here in the United States. You saw just yesterday the State Department revealed that 4 different Chinese media outlets were actually propaganda arms of the Chinese Communist Party and should be declared as such. And that was just one example, whether it's that or the Confucius Institutes or their network of both academics on campuses or their representatives in the media. You see a very sophisticated operation on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to try to influence American politics. And I would say in closing, because I do want to hear from Sean and others, that it's important to understand that there isn't much on our side here in the United States being said, other than from the committee and its friends, about what the real dangers are from communist China. And when you look at our website, presentdangerchina.org, you see a wealth of resources to try to understand just how serious this threat is, whether it's economic, political warfare, the potential military threats from the PRC. There is a wide range of things American citizens need to know. And I'm very happy to be here in Nevada with you and our other friends to simply understand and explain to as many people as possible just what's at stake. And I hope that the Democratic candidates who will be on stage tonight in their debate can have China as one of their topics. Pretty unlikely, I think, but I hope they do, because this is the great test for any American president to see how they will deal with communist China. And so with that, let me turn it back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Brian. I want to underscore something that Brian just said. Obviously, if we are at the cusp, and it seems as though we are, of a pandemic disease breaking out in our country, it would be malfeasant for candidates not to be addressing, at a minimum, that problem. And as we'll be talking about in the course of our program today, that's only one of the urgent issues that does need to be addressed. I'm very pleased to say Jim Marchant has joined us. He is a member of, or has been a member, I guess you're now out of the Assembly here in Nevada, but you served here with distinction. You are running for Congress, as I understand it. That's not the context in which we are visiting with you, but we're delighted to have you here as a Nevadan in particular, but also especially because your background is in business.
And technology.
And in technology. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the threat that is vectored at us from China, of course, involves one or both of those big time. And
exactly.
In particular, one of the things I was impressed by in your bio was the work that you've done to try to keep the internet free,
right,
and as a source of information.
Right.
And as I know we'll talk about a bit more with Sean in a moment, that is not what the Chinese are about. So if you would talk a little bit about that and anything else you'd like to get into with respect to particular economic warfare elements of the Chinese threat, it would be terrific. And thank you for joining us.
As a legislator in Nevada here, one of the things that we addressed oftentimes was the stealing of intellectual property, and like you said, my background is technology. I was had a computer software company, an internet service provider company, and then retired from a voice over IP phone company. So I've run the gamut through technology, and I'm aware of the problem with them stealing our technology and not paying for it and using it to their benefit. So, like I said, through the legislature, that was something we dealt with. And also, the other thing is became aware of the Chinese buying up a lot of infrastructure around the world, actually. And I think, the way it was kind of presented to us is they would buy it up knowing that the government or the local government would default, and they would just by default get the property. And so that was another concern that I was aware of, that I don't really, I guess that's what they do. I think they were going to invest in a bullet train here from Vegas to LA, and I kind of thought, well, maybe that's what they're trying to do, is just own it. So anyway, so we're aware of that, and like I said, my background's technology, and as far as the what I did in my early career as president of the Federation of Internet Service Providers Association, one of the things I recognized right away was that the government, particularly the FCC, wanted to classify the internet as a utility. And I knew then that that would kill the internet in the beginning. This was around mid-90s. And so that was one of the things that I'm probably most proud of that we did with that organization, is to keep the internet free, because I'm a free market capitalist, and that was my main goal there. So yes, there's a lot of concerns, and we just want to, have everybody play fair and not get an advantage. And we need to make people here in Nevada and America aware of what's going on, and I appreciate what you're doing, bringing this to light. And hopefully it'll get out, and we can make sure that some bad things don't happen to us. So.
Thank you very much, Jim, again, for being with us and for those insights. Sean Lin, you spoke a little bit before we all got here, holding the fort for us. I'd like to invite you to share with this audience, maybe for the second time, but share with it some of the things that you've been helping people prior to this event in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina learn about what is being done by the Chinese Communist Party to the people of China. Because I think it really says so much about what they're capable of doing to other people if they're willing to do this sort of thing to their own. And maybe just one of the sort of segues that you might use to start in that is picking up where Jim left off. The Great Firewall and what the Chinese are actually doing to their people in terms of denying them freedom and access to information and all that flows from it. So, again, I should have said, Dr. Sean Lin is, I'm fond of saying, a trifecta. He is a survivor of the Tiananmen Square massacre. He is a practitioner of Falun Gong, which is a religious community that has been brutally repressed, as he will tell you about. He's also a veteran of the United States Army, who served for 2 years as an enlisted man and then for another 7, rising to the rank of a captain as a commissioned officer, in the course of which, thanks to his PhD in microbiology, he became the director of a viral disease laboratory at Walter Reed. A man, in short, who has a lot to contribute to our understanding of the various aspects of the present danger from China. So, Sean, thank you so much for being here, and as I say, for keeping the home fires burning while we were elsewhere.
A different task, right? Ad hoc team, we need to support each other.
That's right.
So thank you, Frank, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jim. I'm glad to join everyone here. So actually, yeah, so want to follow up on your point, and also Brian mentioned about the State Department yesterday's announcement regarding those 4 Chinese government media entity that operate in the United States. So basically, Chinese government actually had a huge ambition in influencing global media. So recently there was a publication by Freedom House. It's called the Chinese government's megaphone, global megaphone. So Chinese government has tried to systematically influence globally through their media entity in different languages, English, Spanish, French. So they own so many TV stations in many continents now. In Africa, also dominant in many of the TV station local, and they broadcast in Chinese government version of the propaganda. So try to change the whole world's opinion, understanding on what communist China is, and try to present a rising China, what they call it, a soft power influencing worldwide. So that's why it's very important for people to understand. Sometimes when you, for example, you read a section of the China news on the Washington Post, and actually that was actually a bought insert, paid advertisement basically, but people didn't know, because it's actually directly from China's Xinhua News Agency. So that's one part of the operation. and so that's influence American people's view on China. And also, these media serve a very important tools for the Chinese government to, we call it, in Chinese language, we call it washing the floor. Because there's so many crimes, so many bloodshedding on the ground, so they need a tool to wash the floor. In Chinese, we call it 洗地, because, for example, they use these media to force some of the religious groups, for victims, to make public remorse on the TVs. It's forced statement on the TVs. So you see Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghur group, they all have victims being put on the Chinese official media, CCTV, to say, oh, I repent, I'm rebel, I kind of against the Chinese Communist government. And they not only broadcast in Chinese to the Chinese people, they also broadcast in the United States too. So these TV media operation in the US also serving this tool to change people's opinion on China's persecution policies. And also they make some false propaganda as well. So they saying, oh, the concentration camp in Uyghur is actually a re-education camp, retraining camp, right? So try to change people understanding that crime is still happening inside this concentration camp. So many Uyghur people were killed. And also for Falun Gong practitioners saying, the Chinese government used their media to tell the world, we use at first, they would say, we use executed prisoners for the organ harvesting. And then they say, oh, no, we now have a established volunteer donation registry system. But actually, if you look at whole China, the number of people who register to donate organs is so pathetic, it couldn't even account for the annual transplant surgery numbers. And because you need a huge number of donations, right? Because not everyone will have a match. And so in China, the Chinese government already started a state-run enterprise to harvest people's organs, especially using those executed prisoners of conscience. And so when Chinese government started persecution of Falun Gong in 1999, suddenly they got millions of people incarcerated in the detention center, in labor camps. And so they become a live organ bank for Chinese government. And so when they use the military system, judicial system, police system to work on this, they can go to the prison, kill the person who has a match, like blood match, tissue type matching, and then take their organ while they're alive. And so then they can sell this organ to the people who went to China for organ tourism and make big money. And it was such a lucrative business in China. And so not only military hospital engaged, civilian hospital engaged. So you see China within 5-6 years after 2000, more than 600 transplant centers booming in China. So every year nowadays, there are more than 60,000 to 90,000 of transplant cases cannot validate their source of organs. And this was actually a report revealed by independent journalist Ethan Gutman. The Chinese government couldn't explain it. The only way they can do it is using the prison of conscience as a source of live organ, and the government kill them and take their organ for making money. And these dark crimes still covered up by Chinese governments through their media propaganda, and also through the Great Firewall the Chinese government established. So many Chinese people, they can visit, for example, New York Times website inside China. They feel like they have the freedom, but what they visit is a falsified version. The sensitive article was taken out. So you feel like you're browsing the New York Times, but you didn't see the article that criticized the Chinese government. And also, Chinese government hired hundreds of thousands of internet police to censor the different opinions on the Chinese social media platform or Weibo, WeChat, all these platforms. And actually, this morning I saw a report, even in Wuhan, in Hubei province, right, where the corona outbreak, happened, is epicenter. The Chinese government actually crank up their information campaign in Hubei province. In Wuhan, they hire more than 1,500 people to censor out the negative comments on the social media. Anyone tell about our hospital may be short of supply, our hospital have many medical staff got infected, any of this negative information, they quickly disappear. The Dr. Li Wenliang, who first exposed about this outbreak, and when he died, so many people will, pay remorse for him. So many people want to show respect. So many people want to voice out their demand for freedom of expression. These voices, within hours, quickly disappear on Chinese internet. It's because Chinese government crank up their information control. So this is life that Chinese people have to face every day. And so many Chinese people living there for such a long time, more than 20 years of this Great Fire War. So many people get used to it. They feel like they live in the real world, but actually so much information will filter out. And the Chinese government keep brainwashing them. And even people inside the United States, they're also being brainwashed by the Chinese government, because Chinese government using streaming setup TV box. So that totally crashed many of the media industry in United States, in Chinese language medias. Because if you buy a streaming box in a Chinese supermarket through Amazon, you buy one, that little streaming box carry dozens of 24-hour TV channels from China, from so many different provinces, from Central TV, China, CCTV. So you basically totally occupied by these dozens of 24-hour channels. And the independent media have no way to compete with whole country's financial power behind it.
I have a question, Sean. Do you think, though, that the way the government responded to the Wuhan virus has undercut their moral authority? Because when so many people say one thing, but they see another,
Yes.
they're willing to believe what they see, and they have relatives who died, and they have friends who are sick. And so when you contrast what's really happening with what the government's saying, that should, if we can get our message and get their message out to the rest of China, that the regime is corrupt and that the regime is not adequately addressing the problem. I mean, they're doing heroic things to try to lock down half of the country, but they're also, as they're doing so, they're also lying, aren't they?
Yeah.
Doesn't that undercut their moral authority?
Definitely. And actually, many Chinese people now to see very clearly, Chinese government is the one that create a problem, even make the problem much worse than it could be. And because even Dr. Li Wenliang in the mid-December already, know that this is a SARS-like outbreak, because he was using the SARS testing kit to identify this outbreak. But Chinese government, brought him to the police station censored it, right? And so even now, 2 months after the outbreak now, the Chinese government still could tell the world what is the origin, of the animal source. Because usually a virus, infect human, this zoonotic transmission usually have an intermediate animal host. And when they're blaming the Huanan seafood market was the source of infection, they couldn't tell the world any animal sample testing positive. 2 months now, no animal sample were testing positive from Huanan seafood market. And also, they couldn't tell the world who's the first patient got infected.
Right.
Yeah, so now United States and also WHO scientists were able to enter China, and there's international calling for these scientists to really investigate what's the origin of the virus. Was it a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, one of the institute that had military collaboration with Chinese PLA medical institutes? Is it a bioweapon system, right? So that's a legitimate question that people can ask for the Chinese government. And the government still hiding the information on this part. And then they use draconian measure, try to show the Chinese people, we can contain the virus. So the Chinese government always say, in the last 1.5 months campaign on TV, you can see very clearly the government say, we're leading the people fighting a war against the virus. On the surface, they feel like they are very righteous to lead people. But the concept is actually manipulating people's mind. Because when they talk about fighting a war against a virus, it undercuts. They can use any method, any kind of sacrifice, and the sacrifice on regular people, ordinary people's life. So they can sacrifice one region, and they say, in order to protect Wuhan, we sacrifice your district. Right? In order to save the whole country, we can sacrifice Wuhan. So how many people will die because of these draconian measures the Chinese government taken? And we see so many reports from Wuhan and in Hubei province, many of the people locked down, and more than 2-3 weeks now, many people have difficulty to even getting food. In the past, one family allowed it to have one person going out of their home or district to buy some food every 2 days. Now there are even tighter restrictions now. Some people's home were locked down, and even the keyhole was sealed. You couldn't get out. What about any accident happen inside the home? Right? One Chinese doctor complained her husband had a stroke at home. He almost couldn't make it to the hospital because of the lockdown pressure. So how many people will die because of this draconian measure? But to Chinese government, it doesn't matter. Chinese people dying just like a number on their statistics. Right? So you can see in history, from 1959 to 1961, more than 30 million Chinese people die, many people starving to death, just because the Chinese government's terrible policy, a great leap forward, tried to catch in with the United States. And at the time, many of the local officers falsified their report to the Chinese central government, saying we produce so much food, and then they need to submit food to the central government, and then the farmers were forced to starve. Many people were starved to death, and they couldn't leave their hometown to beg outside, because they use local military to guard the village, seal the village. So people just die inside. And we is really scared, worried that this might happen again inside China in so many towns. And when you don't have, informations coming out of there directly, because they can quickly wipe out this information on the internet. Yeah, so it's so sad situation. So I think the Chinese government's threat is multifaceted to the whole world, not only to the Chinese people themselves through so many persecution of so many different religious groups, from Falun Gong, Uyghurs to Tibetans to Christians, and it's Chinese government basically waging a comprehensive war against all religions. And then they also present the public health aspect. When they did not contain the outbreak, so many other countries will suffer from it. And I think Japan is one of the countries probably facing another huge outbreak. So it's a very dangerous situation. And then about political aspect, about military aspect, and still in the technology, there's such a comprehensive threat from the Chinese government. And I think fundamentally, this is a really important historic time. The whole country need to wake up to this threat and better prepare for that. And I think it's also definitely every commander-in-chief need to face this issue seriously. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Sean Lin, very much. A lot of questions have been stimulated by some of the comments that have been made. I wanted just to follow up with you, Jim, if I may. There have been estimates that we have lost on the order of $500 to $600 billion a year in the theft of our intellectual property. Have you personally seen this playing out in your industry, the one you previously were a leader in?
In the software particularly, you're able to pirate the software and use it over there freely, and actually sell it. And they can actually copy it, make another similar program, clone type thing, and sell it as a operating system or an application. And,
or as a counterfeit version of yours as well, right?
As well as movies and that type of thing. So that's one of the things.
And in the process of that counterfeiting or manipulation, of course, there are lots of reports that we're seeing things inserted into them that can be used for espionage and data collection.
I'm well aware of the ability when you write a program, you can incorporate backdoors in these programs very easily to gather data, to allow access especially if you're connected to the internet. So it's a lot of issues, and I think the Huawei company that was involved with the cellular stuff and some of the equipment they were making had some of those Trojan horses built in, and that's why President Trump kind of clamped down on them, because they were gathering a lot of data over here that would benefit them, and spying, that type of thing,
right.
Capturing classified technology that for our military that we don't want them to have. And so we've got that's a serious issue that we really need to make sure that we're on top of it. And we definitely need to do a lot of work there. We kind of were asleep at the wheel, let it happen. And we need to, I'm glad we're waking up, and President Trump is well aware of it. And he's doing something about it, I believe. And I'm very thankful for that, because our previous administration was not. They were more in bed with them than not, and that's unfortunate for us here in America.
Brian, I want to come back to the president's current thinking on technology transfers to China, but just staying with this for a moment, in some of our previous programs of the Committee on the Present Danger China, as you mentioned, all of these are available online at presentdangerchina.org. One of the issues that has arisen with respect to this 5G technology and Huawei's dominant position in it at the moment is not just the problem of collecting personal information and data and being able to, use it for intelligence purposes or compromising our intelligence relationships with our allies, for example, but also this Internet of Things, which is now emerging and that can, according to some of the experts we've been talking to, be weaponized against us. Brian, do you want to comment on that maybe, and Jim?
Well, I mean, think about it. The United States today is primarily or substantially an information-based economy. And it's the intellectual property we produce that is the great driver of wealth in this country. The idea that we would not have a internet or a system of transmission of all that information that wasn't completely secure will strike most Americans as absolutely nutty. They'll think that's just a non-starter. And so when President Trump pushes on all this, what he's seeing is, just as a businessman, he is seeing that we are giving our wealth to another country when we allow them to have these back doors, when we allow them to do that. And so to the extent that the United States is not going to be, in the next few decades, a manufacturing power again, or in only limited ways, but that our real wealth creation is going to come from intellectual property and like ventures, then we absolutely have to have an internet and a 5G system that is completely secure. And if I can preempt, we did a poll that you wisely conceived of in the last few weeks, and when Americans were asked about these simple questions, they're either outraged by it or want something done immediately to secure that network. Because sure, their own personal property can be stolen, but the future of the country economically can be stolen. And that's the real thing that people ought to worry about. But let me be clear, the thing that's really causing any kind of confusion is that so many within the American high-tech sector and the financial sector really don't want anything that would smack of any kind of regulation of the PRC and their economic bad behavior. It's almost as if that is just verboten. It cannot be brought up, and anything that would suggest that the Chinese don't play fair is going to harm the U.S. economy, going to hurt the stock market, going to hurt your portfolio, and we just can't do that. When in fact, President Trump has over the years said, we can't simply allow this to occur. Even if there's short-term pain, we're building this for the long run, and it's just not fair. And the American people, to be clear, have a passion for fairness. If people think something is unfair, they want it fixed, which is one reason I'm hopeful in the work of the committee that when people see the facts put before them, they'll demand fairness, starting with a secure system.
Fairness and common sense and
Right.
survival instincts all rolled
Right.
into one. Jim, Internet of Things, is that something you're tracking?
Absolutely, yes. And with the 5G you were mentioned that the phone companies are doing, specifically Huawei, all of that data is capturable
Right.
without us even knowing it. They could build that into their program and just send it right over to anywhere that's our enemy. And right now, until we have everything encrypted, from your device to wherever, there's a lot of data that's in the open that they can gather, and a lot of intelligence type information can be gathered by them. So I'm
But
really
thinking,
worried
just
about
to take
that.
an extreme example, we're told endlessly about the advent of the autonomous self-driving
Absolutely,
vehicle.
yep.
Well,
They
that
can
is
take
all
control of it.
something that can be manipulated and perhaps prompt you to drive into something
Right,
that you hadn't any control over
exactly right.
to protect,
Yep.
perhaps mortal effect.
And a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people understand when you use like a public Wi-Fi and you go to log in to your bank or whatever, a lot of that information is in the open.
Accessible,
It's
right.
not encrypted 100% yet. There are ways that they're doing it, but until we get to 100% encryption from the device, then all of that data is available to be sent to our enemies.
Right. Did you want to say something about this, Sean?
Yes,
Is there
since
another
we
question for you too?
since we are in Las Vegas, so I mentioned one thing is that Chinese government is also very aggressively collecting information through some of the payment system, like WeChat Pay, Alipay, and Las Vegas is one of the experiment places that these companies are so aggressively establish their payment system in Las Vegas. So many hotel here system they already accept WeChat Pay, Alipay. So these looks like a civilian, a company, just kind of like
Just
normal
clearing
business expansion.
payments, yeah.
They just clearing payment. But actually, Chinese government set up a Union Pay, and then they make a rule forcing this Alipay, WeChat Pay to have to go through Union Pay. And Union Pay is controlled by Chinese government, so all your information will still end up in the Chinese government's hands. So they are very actively collecting this information. Through this, they can know people's, your daily behavior, your habits, your hobbies. All information can collect it through your payment system.
Just tease that out a little bit further, if you would, Sean, because what we're seeing, I think, increasingly is evidence that every Chinese company, particularly those that are directly owned or operated by the Chinese government, of course, but every Chinese company is under their law obliged to provide any information that the Chinese government wants with respect to their commercial transactions, their clients, their behavior, and so on, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it goes to the larger point you're making, Jim, that there is a wealth of information that we may unwittingly be watching put into the hands of people who would weaponize it against us.
Yes, and even your facial information, your biological information is also actively collected by the Chinese government too. And for example, Chinese government established a huge sequencing company, BGI, that's based in Shenzhen, China. Many years ago, when U.S. Academic Institute only have a few sequencing machines, BGI one time by hundreds of sequencing machines. It's a very aggressive effort to like a great leap forward movement to collect people's genomic information. And many of the U.S. academic institutes, biotechnology company, because they couldn't do such a large operation and they couldn't do a lot of the bioinformatic analysts behind it, so they subcontract their bioinformatic analysts to Chinese company. So how your genome was analyzed was actually in China. So you, for example, you subscribe a genome typing analyst in a hospital here.
23andMe and stuff like that.
Yeah, so you actually your data was analyzed in China most likely. So that's why how Chinese government is very actively collecting the information for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very dangerous.
Very, very troubling. I wanted to ask you about something else, Brian, if I could. Sean mentioned that we're seeing these advertisements appearing in places like the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I think you mentioned that just recently, I think yesterday, the State Department said those are being placed by instruments of the Chinese government for the purposes of the Chinese government. In other words, they're propaganda instruments. And you wouldn't necessarily know it. You read the fine print, it says advertising supplement, it doesn't tell you who. Should there be a requirement that it say bought and paid for by Chinese propagandists or something to that effect to make distinctive the kind of information? I mean, I'm not a big fan of the Washington Post or New York Times own reporting, I have to say, but this is a whole nother kettle of fish. How should we be addressing that?
Yeah, no, I think this is part of, I would say, the purpose of the committee is to try to explain to people that China has a whole of government approach when it comes to dealing with the United States. Mm-hmm. They don't see distinctions between the private sector and the public sector. In China, the way the Communist Party has evolved, they really do believe they are in a kind of both economic and political war with the United States. Now, they don't say that exactly. Sometimes they do when they want to be belligerent, and sometimes they don't. And they have so much money that they've put in the American political system. Michael Pillsbury, in his book, I think used the number of $13 billion a year in influence operations in the United States. $13 billion? That's a lot of money annually to be putting in to these news media organizations and to these, college professors whom they support, just as that Charles Lieber at Harvard who was giving them all sorts of very sensitive information because all these people...
While he was also working for the U.S. Defense Department.
Right, and so these people become a constituency unto themselves. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, you give enough people enough money, you have enough business ties, and those business ties are with, ultimately, the Chinese Communist Party as well,
right?
That it's all very insidious. And so you see that the Chinese Communist Party has built the kind of apparatus that allows them to have a huge amount of influence, I won't say total, but a huge amount of influence on business in their own country and demand it by law to be able to influence and to gather information and to make sure that, they can steal data, manipulate data, and what have you. They can do that at home. And then it's only a matter of time, as Sean is suggesting, that they're also going to do that abroad. And they've built the kind of economic relations and personal relationships with so many Americans through these influence operations that they think over time they will just absorb the American, both the financial system, the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley, and ultimately the media in Hollywood. Yeah. And so once you get far enough into it and you have your tentacles everywhere, and one has to be careful not to sound conspiratorial or, this is a bad, movie. This is just for the Chinese, I think, world politics. Mm-hmm. This is how a country like theirs would operate, that they need to be that sophisticated and that far-reaching.
A further dimension of this, and I'd like to get each of you to comment on it from your various perspectives, is something called the social credit system, which we've been talking about on these trips around the country. This is a melding of various kinds of technologies by the Chinese, information technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, data mining, facial recognition, and gait recognition, speech recognition, to give them, as we speak, the capacity to monitor essentially everybody in China 24/7
All over the
and
world.
to engage in the kind of crackdowns that they're doing now in connection with this coronavirus business. But yes, exporting it to
Right.
other countries as well. And I'd be interested in, as I say, your respective perspectives on what the implications are as this kind of technology becomes utilized. It takes all of that data that you're talking
Right.
about being put into the hands of the people who are operating this social
Our
credit
enemies,
system
no matter
to
whether,
our detriment.
Yeah, no
right?
matter whether it's China or Russia or anybody. And one of the ways that they do it is through these applications on your cell phone. That a lot of people download. There's millions of apps, and a lot of them come from Russia and China. And I was looking at one that was just a simple messenger application, and they can capture every letter you type into your text. So that's how they do it. And
Using that app, or
using
is it
that
getting
app,
as
absolutely.
a portal to other things that you're doing on
and
your phone
just
as well?
read everything in your phone. They can download your contact list, everything.
Pictures.
And pictures, everything. You don't know it. You don't know what's going over that data stream. And I can promise you that they're capturing that data.
Yeah.
And it's just as simple as just an
But
app.
Jim, the point you're making is it's not just that they're capturing it. I mean, I think people have now become accustomed to Google and
Right.
Facebook capturing our stuff, the kids especially. But you're talking about them using it.
Using it,
And
absolutely.
weaponizing sounds maybe like a
Weaponizing, yeah.
loaded term, but it's
Yeah.
really no exaggeration.
You know,
It's
it could
really
be,
harmful to us.
You know, at some point, if they wanted to be as malicious as shutting down every phone that this app is on at some point. You know, let's say they decide to pull the trigger one day to attack us. I mean, that could be a way it could be done. Well, we're going to shut everybody's phone down,
Or the internet.
or the internet,
Or the grid.
That's exactly
Or
right.
any
The
number of
grid,
things.
absolutely.
Sean,
That's
do
another
you want to talk
huge
about the social credit system as it's being used in China?
Yes, and one other clear example they are abusing it to persecute the different religious groups is that now they are so advanced, so actively collecting people's facial information, your emotional expressions, and now they have algorithm they can analyze, they can tell who has religious belief through your facial emotion, your muscle movements, your characters on your face. They can understand you have certain kind of religion belief, and they can.
Which is a
identify
big
that.
problem
Yeah,
for
it's a
the
big
Chinese
problem.
Communist Party.
Yes, and if you have any opportunity, you actually voice anything, criticize Chinese government, you will rank poorly on their social credit system. So you won't be able to get on the public transportation. You cannot leave the city or things like that. So in the
Get a
past,
job,
yeah,
have
you
an
could get a
apartment,
job.
maybe get food,
Yeah.
get your kids educated.
Yeah. And
No,
it's
all
much
kinds of
tighter.
punishment. And if you play ball, you get benefits as well,
Yes,
right?
Yes,
Rewards.
It's kind of negative selection process
Right.
to ask people to support the Chinese government.
Right.
Well, and also the interesting thing is, so we're having the Democratic debate tonight here in Las Vegas, and you have Michael Bloomberg, who a few years ago, in an interview, said that Chairman Xi is not a dictator, that he has to be responsive to constituents in China. And here's a man who made a lot of money in China by
Still is.
by self-censoring what he says about the Chinese government, because the incentive for him was to make money.
Right.
And because he could make money, he didn't say really what was going on. But he propagates the notion that Chairman Xi, I think he called him president, but I think Secretary Pompeo's calling him Chairman Xi is probably more accurate, Chairman of the Communist Party. That kind of using the social credit system, that's a way of doing two things, I think. One, in a broad sense, they want to condition the Chinese people with their communist ideology.
Right.
They do that all the time. And then the social credit system and all this other invasive technology is a way of monitoring and conditioning the Chinese people to behave a certain way, because the Chinese Communist Party believes in waging this total effort to make China the preeminent power on earth.
Right.
And they know they're going to need all the Chinese people with them. And so the social credit system, it's not, I don't want Americans to think that they're using that merely to spy on their own people. They're using that to condition their people.
And control.
and to condition control,
Right.
and to make them into the kind of communist, subject that they want, that they may need in the future.
Right.
And so this is not just about spying. This is about building a country that is going to challenge the United States and could fundamentally threaten the United States, has been threatening the United States. And that's one of the reasons that we have to take very seriously who the next commander-in-chief is.
Yes.
Do we want someone who sees China for what it, and the Chinese Communist Party, I should say, for what it really is, or is willing to make excuses for them in public?
Right. Another aspect of this, which I think goes to your point about the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party to be in charge of the world's dominant power, is something that one of our colleagues, Reggie Littlejohn, has talked a lot about. The cumulative effects of China's one-child policy are now becoming obvious, and they've been so disastrous. By some estimates, I think Gordon Chang says there's 40 million, mostly military-age men in China for whom there are no women, because the female children, the infants, have been killed. Because if you're only going to have one child, you want it to be a male. This gives rise, Brian, to the potential for the manipulation of those individuals in the furtherance of the motherland's interests,
Right.
to become cannon fodder for some kinds of military excursions, and especially if, as this particular episode you've been talking about with the coronavirus is really shaking the control of the Communist Party, the degree to which its public is willing to put up with what is the controlling feature and
What they're being
dominance.
told.
What they're being told, or how hard their lives are, and the food shortages and what have you. Totalitarians, Brian, as you know so well, have for many, many decades now used what they call social engineering as a means of venting the steam off of those kinds of internal pressures. So talk a little bit about this. And the other piece that I just want to say is what Reggie Littlejohn talks about in terms of the enforcement mechanisms that have been put into place to ensure that women are not pregnant or are not having more than one pregnancy. Now, I guess they're allowed to have two, but to maintain a measure of control over these women, she calls them womb police, is so intrusive. It's so corrosive in the family, as you can imagine, when you have, commissars in the community checking on whether your vagina is empty or not, your womb is empty or not. I mean, this is unbelievably awful. And it's another piece of what I think it's so important for the Committee on the Present Danger of China to be sharing, because it speaks to the character of this Chinese Communist Party, and something we really have to try to get our head around to understand the challenge that it poses to us.
Yes.
Did you want to say something about that?
Yes, because you brought a very important point. Because Chinese government, when the Chinese Communist Party took power in China since 1949, every 5 to 10 years there are political movements targeting different sectors in the communities, from intellectuals, merchants, farmers. So sector by sector, they wipe out the people who will have the courage to speak up against the government from every sector of the community. So after decades, then most people start to get used to, I have to adapt to the Chinese government's hard tactic, control the language, control the speech, control how you think. And then in this society, systematically brainwashing your younger generation from very young to make you support the Communist Party, and that you think the Communist Party is like your mother. You have to love your mother, because love Communist Party equals love your country. That's how he was brainwashing the Chinese people for decades. And then through criticizing traditional Chinese culture like Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, so they severed the Chinese people's connection with the traditional culture, with their own heritage. And people lost their moral standards in China in a very serious way. Even for the persecution of Falun Gong too, Falun Gong is only following the teaching of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, even without political agenda. And they persecute such a large group of people. And then people start saying, okay, I can do anything bad in order to get profit through the system. So in that way, a lot of the Chinese people lost their moral standard in this way. So that's why they can become what Chinese Communist Party want them to be. They call it, you are the nut and bolt in the system. You are not an individual. You're just the nut and bolt that what the Chinese government want you to be.
Yeah.
It's an engineering.
Part of the mechanics of it.
Part of the mechanism, part of the engineer, part of the machine. You are not a living being with your own independent thinking. That's what Communist parties want.
Right.
It's a very sad situation.
Let me wrap this up, if I can, by just asking, again, each of you, one of the things that we've tumbled upon in the work of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, and I want to thank in particular our colleague Roger Robinson, who has been doing enormously important work at RWR Advisory Group and also in the Prague Security Studies Institute. He was with us, in fact, in South Carolina yesterday. When you look at this kind of problem of, say, the social credit system, one of the key companies, one of the key companies involved in the technologies, the information technologies, the surveillance technologies, the facial recognition, and so on, is a company called Hikvision, or Hikvision. I'm not sure which is the proper pronunciation. Whatever it is very closely aligned with the Chinese Communist Party. And it is also deeply embedded in the capital markets of the United States, with public pension funds, not here in Nevada, fortunately, apparently, but elsewhere. And we're at the cusp of having federal government employees, pension funds, invested in companies like Hikvision. This is such an odious company that the federal government has actually sanctioned it for its involvement in the human rights abuses against religious minorities, notably, but not exclusively, the Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps in northwestern China. What would you say, Brian, if we had the president's ear, to encourage, well, for one thing, making sure that it's not only not legal to do business with a company like Hikvision, but that you can't invest in it either. You can't enable it through the kinds of access to capital and the legitimization that goes along with it. And if we don't do that, aren't we in fact contributing, as you've suggested, to the enormous proliferation of these kinds of technologies and control mechanisms elsewhere around the world? And we found in our poll that was something the American people did not cotton to, particularly the idea of it coming here.
No, that's a great question, Frank. As you were asking it, I was thinking about, the one-child policy in China. That whole thing was designed to dehumanize the Chinese people, to demoralize them. Because what's more fundamental than having children for a human being or a family? Right. And if you can dehumanize people and demoralize them, you can remake them into the perfect communist man or woman, the social engineering you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so the demoralization is necessary to do that, as you say. With this question of whether or not Americans ought to be investing in Chinese companies that do these bad things, any American, such as in our poll, when they heard about, would you invest in this kind of company that persecuted people and did bad things and what have you, the average American says, well, of course not. That would be wrong. That would be immoral. Type of responses we were getting. And so you have in this country on Wall Street, and I think the president's been in a big contest with these folks, they want a certain kind of demoralization too. They don't want American investors to be looking at where their money goes in China. They simply want them to invest. And they don't want it, either they don't want it known or they just want you to look the other way when it comes to investing in a company like Hikvision. Just invest because you can make money, and making money is the most important thing. Meaning, American politics, American finance should be demoralized. And even though
Amoralized maybe as well.
well, yeah, first you have to demoralize it, though, to make it amoral, right? And that's the process we're going through now, and that's something that Roger Robinson has been working on and that you have articulated so well. And I think, if the president were sitting here, the president, because he's an America First type of president, if he actually had explained to him the parameters of all this, would not want that to continue. And I believe to the extent that he does follow these things, he wants it stopped. But he does so over the objections of a whole bunch of Wall Street types throughout both the administration and influencing the administration who want this to continue unabated, because that globalist mentality, which the president has been fighting, has permeated so much of official Washington.
Yeah.
And that globalism is the enemy of, I would say, both America and the kind of morality it takes to defend the free world. And so that's the great contest today.
There's an even more insidious aspect to this, it seems to me, Brian. It looks as though many of these companies in which these American investors, individuals and institutional investors, are having their money entrusted. And it's not in every case they're making an active decision to do it. They're investing in these indexes, and these indexes basically say, this is where you're going to put your money. The return on investment isn't all that great, particularly in the wake of this coronavirus business in Chinese companies. Now, that may be a short-term thing. It may be a longer-term thing. We'll see. But the people who are making the money are those Wall Street masters of the universe who are getting their commissions, handsome commissions. I think Larry Fink, one of the captains of this whole enterprise, got something like $578 million in compensation last year. And that doesn't even take into account the increased value of equities that he owns as well. So that's what's kind of galling about this, is it's not necessarily the best interests of the people whose money is being put into these kinds of enterprises that's operating here.
Which makes you really have to wonder then, if the investor's not making money and just the fund manager, the guy who owns BlackRock or any of these other big firms, if they're the only ones making money, what's really going on here?
Right.
But because our financial system has a certain opaque quality to
Very
it,
opaque.
that people don't quite understand what these things actually mean. And these guys are all masters of the universe, like Mike Bloomberg, that I seem to be picking on here. But, all this is above mere mortals to understand. And so trust us, we're the masters of Wall Street. We know what's best for you. But what's best for you may not be what's best for America. And it turns out, to your point,
not
not
for
even
you
for
either.
you, not even for you either.
For us,
but really
for me.
But really
Right.
good for the guys on Wall Street.
Right.
And so you do see a real contrast right now between everyday Americans and our financial elites. And I think this election year we can highlight to the greatest extent possible, to the extent that we can do that, it'll be very useful in the future. Because either
It's
we're
vital. Absolutely
it's
vital.
absolutely vital. Either we're going to represent the interests of America and the free world, or we're going to be subsumed by communist China. It's one or the other.
Amen. Sean Bling, what would you want the president to do if you had his ear and an opportunity to make a recommendation to him?
Yeah, I think for the commander-in-chief, a full comprehension about China's threat is very vital to the national security, national interest. And because Chinese government is not just a threat on the trade issues. That's definitely is a big one, but it's way more than that, and their ambitions is way bigger than just on the trade and just taking U.S. money, and they through their 2025 project, their 2035 project, you can see their ambitions on so many fronts, on the technology, on biotechnology, and social engineering, and even ideology expansion to the globally. So their threat, I think, is to the humanity. So I think actually the U.S. president is a leading power in the whole world to protect the human civilization. So I think this is a very huge task.
Yeah.
So you need to face the real threat seriously.
Yeah, beginning with that. Jim Marchant.
Yeah, some of these pension programs and people that do invest in these companies, I think we could maybe help out by identifying which ones are, because they may not even know that that they are doing the things that they're doing. And if we could help identify that, that would be maybe one suggestion we could give to the president and his staff is, you know, tell us which one of these companies are doing this. Just like Huawei, you made everybody aware of that. You know, and these applications I'm talking about, there's millions of them out there that we probably need to know that are compromising our data.
Yeah.
And so it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem we need to try to get on top of.
Yeah. We have been doing some of that in
Yes.
these briefings
Right.
around the country, particularly where we've found, Jim, in the public pension funds of the state of Iowa, for example,
Right.
the state of New Hampshire. South Carolina won't let you know what's in their portfolio, so we've not been able to evaluate that, but we're trying. But we're finding in state after state after state, there are the Hike Visions, there are
Right.
companies, maybe a Huawei or ZTE
Right.
for sure, another company that's been sanctioned,
Right,
or
exactly.
AVIC, which builds weapon systems with which the Chinese are targeting our men and women in uniform, but probably the rest of us as well. I mean, these are things that when, as Brian said, in this national poll, which is available at presentdangerchina.org, people responded quite sensibly, overwhelmingly, really. I think in example after example after example. And the more they knew about what was going on, the more that was the case. And interestingly enough, I mean, you've been in politics, so I'm sure polls are familiar to you. As important as that top line are the demographic crosstabs, as they're called.
Yes.
And the really stunning thing about this poll is virtually every single subcategory you look at had a similar kind of reaction, not just majority, usually strong majority, saying, be very careful about what you're dealing with China. Don't strengthen them. Don't weaken us. Don't make us more dependent upon them. Mind the security implications. So I might just close by saying two things. One is a further complication, in addition to the Wall Street mavens and how these monies are being allocated, is a sort of poster child, in a way, of the rot here. A congressman from Indiana by the name of Jim Banks last week wrote a letter to the governor of California, who was among those who was put on notice by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo about how states are being targeted. States like Nevada are being targeted by the Chinese. Your governors, your state legislatures, your pension funds, and so on. Governor Newsom, I believe, was in the room when Mike Pompeo made this particular warning about your pension funds. And as it happens, as Congressman Banks points out, there's a fellow by the name of Yu Ben Meng, who is the chief investment officer for the California Public Employees Retirement System, the largest public pension fund in the country, some $370 billion under management. And this guy worked for a while for CalPERS, as it's called, then as part of something called the 1,000 Talents program, which has been described, I think, by the FBI and others as basically an intelligence collection operation, recruitment and, acquisition of intellectual property and so on, including from that professor at Harvard I think you talked about, Brian. These folks are working for Communist China. And in this case, this fellow actually said to one of the propaganda arms of the Communist Party at the time, People's Daily, that it was an honor to work for the motherland. Well, he's now back at CalPERS, and he's making investment decisions for the California public employees. It's not just Larry Fink and Steve Schwartzman and the other masters of the universe in Wall Street. It's also these kinds of characters. And this is a particularly problematic one, and I think Congressman Banks is right to say he ought to be fired or at least investigated. But the other thing I just wanted to say, and it's it's evident in this poll, I think, as well, the American people expect our government to provide for their security. And I have to say I was a little troubled by some tweets that the president put out yesterday about how, there's too much use made of this national security justification for being careful about technology that we're providing. I mean, selling openly, let alone having stolen. We have to mind the fact that if you're dealing with a government, with a country ruled by a government that has these characteristics, and we've been talking about them in several different respects here in Nevada and elsewhere, and we will be in the days ahead for this Committee on the Present Danger of China, we owe it to the American people, especially our government owes it to the American people, that we not disregard or pay inadequate attention to the fact that fundamentally it is a mortal threat to our survival as a free people, and therefore that the national security does matter intensively. With that, I want to thank Jim Marchant, Sean Lin, Brian Kennedy for joining me, Frank Gaffney, for this edition of our 2020 Policy Battlespace Threat Briefing here in Las Vegas, Nevada. We're very glad that we were able to pull it off and appreciate again everybody's forbearance and the timing. Thank you for paying attention to this really urgent message, and please visit our site, presentdangerchina.org, for more information on all of these subjects. In the meantime, God bless you, and I hope the people of Nevada make informed decisions, including in the basis of information that we've just shared. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.